So we all these days walk around wearing masks. It's become the new norm, increasingly becoming the new norm. Although, as you know, there are all sorts of protestations and angry people who don't want to wear masks for one reason or another. I know that it is probably confusing to a lot of people why some people wouldn't wear masks. And of course, human behavior, it's nothing new. There are always going to be people who are unwilling to do what they are told, or who believe that in some way they are an exception to the rule. We do know that, for example, in the Spanish flu epidemic of 1918, there were plenty of people who refused to wear masks. And studies of that kind of thing have shown two traditional reasons why people refuse to wear masks in an epidemic. One is that people who aren't particularly worried about their health. They don't generally have any health anxiety. They often think that they seem to be fine. No matter what they do, everything is fine. And that takes us to the other kind of original refuser, and those people who are just naturally very optimistic about their health. Nothing will happen to me, it won't affect me, I'm fine, all of those kind of things. That is something we do see a fair amount of these days, although these days often complicated by beliefs that people have that either that somehow they're being controlled or manipulated in some way, and also that their own individuality seems to be more important than that of the group. I do find it quite interesting and curious that these concerns exist, because they reveal two strange things to me. Number one is that for all the people who claim that people who wear masks and people who follow the rules that have been established are being controlled by the governments, they're trying to control us all, they're manipulating us and so on. And the fascinating thing to me is that these people all get this information from Facebook and perhaps other odd social media platforms here and there as well, largely from Facebook. And it becomes the latest Facebook video is this, and everyone is spreading it around, and this is the new truth. They're being controlled by Facebook. They're being manipulated by Facebook. Facebook, as you know, manages the algorithms about what we see and what we don't see. We also know that Facebook has very huge issues of its own about what it's biased towards and so on. For me, the end result is that people are being told what to do by Facebook, not the governments. The governments tend to be telling the opposite of what Facebook is telling them to do. And they say that they're free and they don't want to be controlled, and they won't be told what to do, and yet the Facebook says this and everyone does it. Anyway, the other issue that I find curious and much more alarming than that, for me, what the current refusal to wear masks is all about is really about the over-assertion of individualism, that we've reached a point as human beings where our individuality trumps the importance of the group, the race, the human race, the general population, our community, our country, whatever it may be. And we no longer have much of the ability to act in the interests of the whole, and we tend to think our own individual interests are much more important, our own supposed rights. And some people will go as far as to take the wearing of a mask as an infringement of their rights, as an effort to silence them. All of these things were probably coming from the Facebook dialogue, but boiled down to my individual rights are more important than yours and more important than those of the human species as a whole. And the curious thing I find about that is that this is usually by people who give lip service to the idea that we are all one and that we all must love each other, and namaste, you know, the soul in me sees you, everyone is equal and wonderful and lovely, but until it comes to wearing a mask. Anyway, I'm actually not here to talk about those kind of masks. what fascinates me most about the whole mask phenomenon is, of course, that we've always been wearing masks. Those of us who studied psychology know that the very core function of identity starts off with donning a mask, and that is the personality. The word persona is the Greek word for mask, and we wear a personality, a mask, in order to handle the world in all sorts of ways. And that's the kind of masking I want to talk about today. To a large extent, the purpose of the personality mask is functional and positive. It is how we get ourselves through the world. If we showed the world exactly who we were and exposed all our insecurities, our fears, our weaknesses, on the one hand, we become vulnerable to being judged for a whole bunch of things that might not be relevant. And secondly, we would probably offend everyone if we really showed what we felt about everything and what our reactions were. All of us conceal some of our feelings about things and some of our reactions about things for the sake of manners, for the sake of social harmony, and for the sake of clinching the deal, or whatever the case may be. So certainly masks are functional. Having a persona is important because it is also an identity, and it is identity in the world. It identifies who we are, what our role is, and to some extent also how we are expected to behave. So for example, a politician or a manager or something like that needs to wear a mask in order to fulfill their functions. It's that in every working situation, we need the mask in order to take on the role, so that it enables people to interact, it enables people not to respond personally to each other. And so it's an example of how in the rest of our lives, those kind of masks might work the same way, at least some of the time. We are essentially protecting ourselves with what are called defense mechanisms. Defense mechanisms, amongst other things, prevent us having to deal with difficult or troubling emotional and other psychological issues. And most of the time, defense mechanisms are natural protectors of us that prevent us from getting into trouble, from being exposed, like I was saying earlier on, and protect our sense of identity as well. Sometimes, of course, those defenses become too much and interfere with our functioning in the world and interfere with our relationships with others and so on. But to a large extent, the purpose of the personality is to provide identity and direction. We approach the world through that personality. Our behavior, our actions in the world, all are part of our personality. We all have the experience of people who get us wrong and how we can sometimes get them wrong. When we get to know them later on, they aren't quite the person we thought they were. It doesn't mean that they were fake. It means that the mask, by the nature of a mask, also conceals. So the personality mask has a function both to conceal some of the truth unmasked self, as well as to project a specific idea, a specific version of the self that is largely designed to be functional in the world or to create a certain impression. On the other hand, one of the very important reasons we wear a mask is to protect ourselves from being hurt. So a defense isn't only a defense against our own feelings, but it's a defense against other people who want to use those feelings or the knowledge of those feelings against us. And it's very possible, perhaps even easy, for that to become too much of a good thing. So what happens in the end is the defense starts creating too much of a barrier between ourselves and the world. A lot of the mask and the defense is built from early life experience. We learn that behaving in a certain way causes a certain reaction, so we conceal that behavior. We learn that presenting ourselves in a certain way produces a certain good response. So we learn to emphasize that behavior. Again, it's not necessarily pathological, it doesn't necessarily create a problem. But if we continuously develop the persona without really ever in our lives addressing the issue of the authentic self, we eventually become trapped in that persona, and it becomes part of our problem rather than our solution to a problem. Worst case scenario is that by continuously wearing different kinds of social masks like that to prevent ourselves getting hurt, we close ourselves off from more authentic relationships by not allowing people to see who we really are, and perhaps in the end not enabling a relationship to form because we actually have that barrier in front of us and kind of miss that opportunity. Also, we tend to get stuck in our old beliefs. If we've created a mask because of a difficult childhood experience, by continuously, perpetually presenting that mask to the world, what we're really doing is we continuously and perpetually, in reaction to that childhood experience, we're ending up holding onto it, or at the very least, continuing to be scarred by it in some way. Mostly, in the end, the purpose of wearing a mask is on the one hand to gain approval, and on the other hand to minimize conflict. And the masks that we wear to gain approval might go quite far. We could wear a mask to create an impression of a particular lifestyle, that we're more perfect than we really are, that we are wealthier than we really are, or that we're living a particular lifestyle that doesn't really match the truth. And effectively, we hide behind those masks, especially when we externalize them through things like the label of the clothes, of the car. Basically, we can get trapped in an artificial world that we create in order to create a certain impression and prevent whatever it is that we fear, which is generally not being accepted by others. That is generally the fear that drives people to wear certain masks, creating the impression of a lifestyle or a life that we believe is desired by others is a way to avoid being not liked by others. Ironically, might often have the opposite effect, and as I've said earlier, eventually we sense each other's masks. We know that we've hit some kind of a barrier or something is false, because ultimately a mask is a little bit like a two-dimensional object. It's thin, it doesn't have the depth and the complexity of the real self. The real self is full of contradictions and complexities. Masks tend to be consistent because they've covered up all the problems. So it presents a consistent version of ourselves, which should set off all the alarm bells for someone else, because human beings aren't really that consistent. We always contradict ourselves in the end. What is interesting in that portrayal of a particular lifestyle is that it isn't a set thing that this is going to be a grand or better lifestyle, that, as in the example I just gave. Sometimes we wear a mask to play ourselves down, either to make it look like we don't live the lifestyle that we do, the opposite kind, or even worse perhaps, that we are afraid of judgment and afraid of reaction, so we wear the most invisible mask possible. Well, that's a mask that makes us invisible. The mask itself is very visible. So playing ourselves down, avoiding rejection, protecting ourselves from judgment and from emotional interaction, exposing our own weaknesses, essentially a form of withdrawal. And a mask can be a bit like a wall in that regard, that we hide ourselves behind. Then there are socially enforced masks, where the rules of society tend to assert or require certain masks. And even in this more enlightened age, we tend to fall for those, despite the fact that we fight them. And those would be the ones that are gender-based. we still live in a culture that expects men to display strength, to not display emotions, to display characteristics that we associate with masculinity. And similarly, with women, we demand that they behave more sweetly, more helplessly, that conceal their true feelings, to the extent that they would be expected to not eat as voraciously and as excitedly as a man, or not make the noises that we do allow in a man. And while those are unmistakably gender issues in our society, they are all about you are required to wear a certain mask. And that mask is the mask of the feminine or the mask of the masculine, so defined by society's rules. There are also other kind of stereotypical society-induced masks that many of us fall into and which we can mostly recognize ourselves. So things like the person who's always cool, calm and fine, always seems to be the master of his or her world, seems to be in charge, has mastered themselves, has mastered the world, cool, calm and collected. But usually such a person beneath the surface has got a lot of bottled up emotions. You get the person who's always joking, always being funny. Humor is sometimes considered a very strong defense mechanism. It does mean that that person might have a way to look at the world through humorous eyes, tells a joke, creates a certain impression of everything's okay, but underneath the surface is feeling lonely and sad and those kinds of things which would create them to be rejected or not liked by other people. So they wear the mask of humor in order to be accepted and to not face whatever demons it is that they're not looking at. In our very achievement of oriented society, you also get people who portray themselves as achievers, always doing the right thing, always going for the goal, always the one who will volunteer and do whatever needs to be done, can even be a little bit of a perfectionist. Those people tend to also be stubborn and obsessive and not trusting of others, and the mask might conceal that they don't actually trust others. On the other hand, you get those who are always the martyr. Don't worry, I'll do it. They're always displaying compassion, they're always portraying themselves as wanting to help or wanting to save others and protect others, all of those kind of things. Those people believe they occupy a very important place in the world, and make their role very critical and often create very uncomfortable people around themselves. So the mask of the martyr is actually one that other people can recognize and don't know how to respond to. We need to be more self-aware in order to realize that our mask is having some kind of negative effect. Another example of those that other people tend to see through is people who are excessively self-deprecating. They're always bringing themselves down, they're unworthy. We all saw them at school, the ones who said they couldn't do the work, it was very hard, they're struggling, and then they get an A. We all know those people who play themselves as a very negative version of themselves and play themselves down so much. And it's probable that such people are actually trying to insulate themselves from being hurt or from the negative results of being of a bad experience, of doing badly at school. So it can be think of the absolute worst and then you're going to be fine whatever happens, which is a Stoic philosophy. But portraying yourself as a particular person is kind of claiming a humility that you don't have, and that is a defense mechanism which tends also to create barriers between ourselves and the world. The bottom line is that all defense mechanisms create that kind of barrier between ourselves. You get those people who are always trying to please others and always doing things to please others and looking for approval of others, but behind their backs they might feel resentful, they might feel unappreciated, they might even complain. I always do things for other people, but they never do anything for me. They're wearing the mask of the people pleaser, so it's not surprising that they're always going to occupy that role. Interestingly, such people are usually always looking for advice or help from others in some way, because they're also trying to please people. They always wanted to make look like, well, I'll just do what you think I should do, or what everyone's going to benefit from, and they seem like the self-deprecator to underemphasize what it is that they in particular want. There are countless masks, in fact. I'm just giving an example of some of the common ones, but there are many, many masks that we wear as the personality that actually prevent authentic relationships to happen. It's interesting that astrology addresses the issue of the mask, and astrology says essentially that we construct a persona in order to handle the world, in order to contain our motivations, our reactions, and the results. Create what astrologers call the rising sign, which is often interpreted as the persona, the mask behind which the essential self conceals itself. But the bottom line becomes that in the end, if you consistently and continuously live with the mask and live behind the mask, you eventually start losing touch with your real self. It's not uncommon for people who consistently wear the mask, like the ones I've mentioned, like people pleasers or martyrs or whatever, to gradually start feeling a disconnect with others. They ironically start feeling that people don't know them well and don't understand them properly. They feel misunderstood and isolated, and can eventually slip into depression. That is the case of a mask gone too far. So while masks are important and necessary defense mechanisms, they, in the end, like all temporary solutions to problems, need to be put aside, and we need to get to the heart of the matter. And the heart of the matter is the identity, the real, authentic self. Hopefully, eventually, a tipping point is reached and we begin the journey to self-discovery. In the end, it may be that we learn how to put masks on and off. We need to learn to create masks that are useful and functional, but that don't actually conceal the real self underneath, where we're able to take them off and say, I've performed that function, but this of course is me. In the end, the authentic self has authentic relationships, and that's going to make them work and last. There's no greater sharing that you can do with another person than share yourself and share your true self. And we respond to that in other people. We see it as a bond of trust. So although we might use masks to protect ourselves and defend ourselves and all those kind of words that I've used, in the end, it is the absence of masks that creates better relationships with other people. Yes, we need certain types of masks, such as the way to behave in business and the way to behave in certain social situations. Those are real things. We shouldn't just always be displaying our true self in a social situation, but we must be careful not to lose sight of what that true self really is. And that means a journey of self-discovery, and it means learning to show your real self and share your real self with the people closest to you. Learning to become self-aware enough that you begin to notice the masks that you're wearing, and that you begin to notice how to take them off, what happens when you take them off. So a great exercise in self-development, in self-knowledge and self-understanding, and one that I invite you to take, is to consider for yourself, what mask do I wear in which situation? Identify situations, people who you're afraid of, people you're trying to impress, people that you admire. Notice the mask. Think about, what is that mask? Where does it come from? It's profoundly liberating, because sometimes we don't even realize the mask that we're wearing. And in the end, letting go of those kind of masks can be the ultimate experience of self-knowledge and self-actualization. Before I go, there's one last thing I'd like to say about the face covering masks that so many people are wearing and a few people are experiencing a little bit of resistance about. Research has been done to demonstrate that when we mask half our faces, we are perceived as more attractive by others. And it might be a reason why veils and wedding veils in particular exist. That is speculated. A half concealed face makes people more interesting, alluring, and attractive. So for those of you having trouble wearing a mask to protect everyone else from the danger of infection, remind yourself you're putting on your beautiful face to handle a world that is not so beautiful at the moment. So wear a mask. And of course, here on TV, we get to interact without wearing a facial mask. So I look forward to seeing you, face and all, next week.